Hello, this is Table Talks with Kendall Hill, and today we are driving into looking at the feminist perspective using two popular TV shows and how they suggest what is happening in American values and cultures at that time. Social issues have been pushed by pop culture throughout the years and have evolved the mindset of society, what is seen as normal, and the values it holds. A medium of pop culture that has been a huge platform is television. The TV shows I Love Lucy and Grace and Frankie show by using the feminist perspective how the role of women in relationships have evolved from the 50s to the 21st century. Here we are talking about the classic show I Love Lucy that aired in 1951 till 1957 and Grace and Frankie, which aired in 2015 and is currently on Netflix. Both these shows use comedy to bring the audience in. Meanwhile, the shows are complex and challenge or talk about issues that were going on in society at those times. Yet people didn't look at it as unacceptable because humor was attached to it, but still planted ideas and addressed certain topics. We're going to look at the first two episodes of each TV show to see what started these two shows. The plot of I Love Lucy is essentially Lucy and Ethel, the two main characters, both really good friends living in the same apartment complex, are pushing the boundaries of wanting to go out and be adventurous. They're not the typical housewife, yet their husbands want them to be. And so they're constantly going on these adventures. They're not organized. They're all over the place. And it's just taking us through day by day what their life is like. In the other TV show, Grace and Frankie, it's about the two women taking on the world in their next phase of life after their husbands just told them that they were gay and in love with one another. So this takes us through what happens after that and how they're adjusting to this and how they've spent the last 40 years of their lives dedicated in this relationship, and now their husbands have had an affair for 20 years and they're adjusting to all this newness. So with that, I would like to introduce Tori Kintz, who is an avid watcher of I Love Lucy and Grace and Frankie. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. I'm excited to dive into this. And Caitlin Schwab, who is a very strong feminist in today's world. Hi, Caitlin.
Hello.
How are you?
So good.
Awesome. The feminist perspective observes gender and its relation to power, both at the level of face-to-face interaction and reflexivity within a social structure at large. It goes into gender norms and how men and women are socially constructed, what is okay and what society has created, and how through pop culture, these values and traits at that time, have been challenged and pushed, revealing what is actually happening in society. So we're going to look at these two TV shows and just kind of dive into that. So what was the role of women at that time in the 50s and today, and how does I Love Lucy and Grace and Frankie kind of push those boundaries and show what is happening in that time?
Yeah, well, starting with I Love Lucy, I mean, we start off the episode and both Lucy and Ethel are in the kitchen, which I think shows one of the values of America is that they value the role of women as homemakers in our country. And then they're just discussing what they want to do for their anniversaries, and I thought it was interesting. They felt like they couldn't bring up exactly what they wanted to do, but they had to persuade their husbands to do something that they wanted to do, which I think shows a lot about the value that America placed on a woman's voice back then, was that they didn't really have a voice unless it was in an area that they were seemed to be suited in, like in the kitchen or as a mom or anything like that. But anybody who made the plans always kind of fell to the male perspective or the male role in the family household.
Well, I think it's really important to look at when in history I Love Lucy came out. It was just a few years after World War II had ended. And in World War II, women had to take on jobs that men in the war had to give up. And so then after the war ended, they had to go back to being just wives and moms and working in the home while men went back to the jobs that they had had. And I think even though I Love Lucy does fit the gender norms a lot, it does also push the boundaries of what was acceptable for that time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that Lucy definitely pushes the social norms that most women back then were not comfortable doing. She decided that her and Ethel wanted to go out to a nightclub, and then the boys decided that they wanted to go to a boxing club. And when that idea was presented in front of the husbands disagreed, but Lucy would not submit, which is not normal, and decided that she and Ethel instead were going to go out to the nightclub by themselves.
Right, and and Ethel shows that, you know, even in this whole first episode, the anniversary that they were celebrating is Ethel's, so it's not Lucy's, but Ethel shares with Lucy in the kitchen what she wanted to do for her anniversary, and Lucy was like, okay, well, let's do it. Let's get the guys to do it. And Ethel was still in this place, and I think that she still resembles what is going on in that time of women still submitting, still being afraid to share what they actually want to do. Mm-hmm. But Lucy was pushing the boundary at that time, and she was carrying it out and saying, okay, well, if you want to do this, let's do it and let's figure it out. So yeah, I definitely agree on that. So now let's go into Grace and Frankie.
So in that show, it also shows the contrast between two different women in the same time period, same culture, who's still pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable for women in that time. So Grace is the wife that follows all the rules, follows all the norms all of her life, and then Frankie's more of the hippie, free spirit, pushes the boundaries, does more what she wants to do. And you can just see that contrast even in the first episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also observed in the first episode of Grace and Frankie just like the differences in roles in general. I mean, the men in I Love Lucy, they were kind of sitting together, like smoking, talking about how they wanted to go to a boxing match. And then we transition to Grace and Frankie, however many years later, and here they are announcing to their wives at dinner eating shrimp that they are gay. So this role of just a less masculine side of men has become okay in our American values. And then women are no longer in the kitchen. They are all eating out together. So that is something that America, I feel like, doesn't really value as much today as back in I Love Lucy. They also, the language I also observed in the differences in both episodes was so drastically different.
Yeah.
I mean, there's probably like 8 F-bombs.
Yeah. And
so much talk about sexual things and drug use and all of these like coping mechanisms that people use today that are acceptable to use today that were not acceptable like 50 years ago.
Right. Because, I mean, even in I Love Lucy, they show that, you know, Lucy and Ricky, they sleep in separate beds, you know? That's just like such a boundary that's been pushed even now to this day, because now we have just nudity seen on screen and everything. And Grace and Frankie, you know, you're looking at these women who, you know, have very open language. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of cussing. Yeah. There's a lot of talking about sex and about their own personal bodies and everything. And it's just making what's uncomfortable comfortable now. So what's next, you know?
Yeah.
But speaking more specifically about feminism, it's really interesting to see how there's this contrast in both I Love Lucy and in Grace and Frankie of this independent woman, the woman who is kind of ahead of her time and the woman that is still kind of stuck in her time. So you have both of these characters kind of bouncing off each other. And then that goes into their relationships. And so now we look at how relationships have changed and how the two shows show relationships with their husbands, with each other, and now their husband's own relationship. And so let's look at that.
Great. As we look at Fred and Ethel's relationship in I Love Lucy, we see them in the first episode celebrating their 18th year anniversary, and Fred, instead of calling it a celebration of their marriage, he calls it a celebration of mourning, which also shows that marriage or happiness in a marriage is not something that is a cultural norm that America kind of values and pushes. And we also see that contrasted in Grace and Frankie, where Robert and Grace are having a discussion after the men have already told their wives that they are leaving them. We see Robert telling Grace that he thought that she would be relieved that their relationship was ending, because she wasn't happy. And another example of relationships in both of these shows, I think we look at Grace and Frankie, and after she is in this period of just kind of mourning her relationship being over, she goes and she buys cigarettes because she tells the clerk that she's gonna smoke because Saul never let her smoke. So we see that controlling aspect, which was also something that was very prevalent in the 50s in I Love Lucy.
Right, and it goes into the feminist perspective as well. I mean, that is what the feminist perspective is the relation in gender to power, both at face-to-face interaction and reflexivity within social structure at large. And so the social structure at large is marriage, and the face-to-face is man versus woman. And so the struggle of power there, and how it's challenging and pushing what is happening in society today.
I think that in our society today, marriage is still very much pushed and expected, but I think it's more as a form of power and control rather than being for someone's happiness or what they want for their lives. So it seems like even now, a woman's biggest achievement is to get married, to raise a family, to have kids, keep the house, and in exchange for that, they get financial security and they have some form of safety in that. But I think that's really dangerous because it's still giving men all of the power. And in Grace and Frankie, if your marriage ends, if you get widowed or divorced or you're just single forever, if we put all our value into that and we let men have all the control in those relationships, then when women are on their own, they won't be able to function successfully in society. I think with the feminist view, there's no arguing that there are biological differences between men and women, but our society has attached different things to these genders, how you should act, what you should wear, how you behave, what your roles are. So there's no biological reason that women should be working in the kitchen and men should be doing the finances. We are all capable of doing those things.
Yeah, just like in Grace and Frankie, where Grace is saying, I followed all the rules. Why didn't anyone tell me there were no rules? She was insinuating that she did everything that she thought she was supposed to do as a woman, as a wife, that she took care of the kids, she made a family, she made a home, she made sure that Robert didn't have to worry about any of the domestic side of things, like dinner or making sure, there was food on the table because he was always working. So the rules that society has put in place for the roles of a woman essentially sets a woman up for failure. So what? What does this say about our cultural values, about American society at these specific moments in time when I Love Lucy came out in the 50s and Grace and Frankie currently?
I think in comparing the two shows, so I Love Lucy and Grace and Frankie, you can see how far women and women's rights have come in the past 50, 60 years. The women clearly have control over what they're going to wear. They have some control over what they're doing. They can drop the F-bomb and talk about sex and other things that wouldn't have been acceptable back then. But in a way, they are still so controlled by the men in their lives. The men decide that they're in love with each other and that they're ending the relationships. The women have no say in that and no way of dealing with it, and so they're just left powerless.
Yeah, I also think what's cool about using this form of media to portray this idea of feminism is that in the rest of the show we see Grace and Frankie realizing that these have been the cultural norms for, like you said, the last 60 years. And yes, we've come so far, but they're realizing that they still have lived this life of being controlled by the male figures in their lives. And we see them kind of entering in this journey of breaking that and deciding who they are as individuals and kind of empowering themselves as women, and also using this form of media, empowering the feminine culture today in America to just realize who they are and really step into who they are as individuals.
So in conclusion, we have looked at the role of women and their relationships in the light of the feminist perspective, and how pop culture, specifically television, using I Love Lucy and Grace and Frankie, have been a huge segue and being a part of evolving and revealing what is going on in American society in that time. Well, that concludes our table talks with Kendall Hill. Thank you, Tori and Caitlin, for joining me.
You're welcome.
Yeah, have a wonderful day.